Amara Wilson stood motionless on the crowded train platform, the noise of arriving trains and hurried footsteps fading into the background. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her worn leather trunk, the same trunk that carried everything she owned and everything she hoped to become. The air smelled of coal and cold metal. Riverbrook Station. This was supposed to be the place where her new life began. Across from her stood Harold Pierce, the man whose letters had once made her smile in the dark, the man who promised safety, companionship, and a future far away from the quiet cruelty of the city. Now, his hands trembled. His face slowly drained of color, as if the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting away from hers, to the platform, to the people passing by, anywhere but her face. This isn't going to work, he muttered, his voice barely louder than a whisper. For a moment, Amara said nothing. She had known this silence before, the pause people take when disappointment wrestles with prejudice. She inhaled slowly, then finished the sentence he was too afraid to say. "You didn't expect me to be black." The words landed softly, but they hit harder than any shout ever could. Harold flinched. It was as if speaking the truth out loud made it real, unavoidable. Around them, the station continued to move, unaware that Amara's entire future had just shattered in plain sight. 3 weeks of exhausting travel. 6 months of carefully written letters. Long nights dreaming of a place where her intelligence mattered more than her skin. All of it collapsed in a single heartbeat, the moment Harold Pierce finally saw her. "In your letters," he stammered, stepping backward, "you wrote so beautifully. I imagined someone different." Different. The word burned. He clutched the bouquet in his hand, flowers already drooping, just like the courage behind his polite words. "Should I have warned you?" Amara asked quietly, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "Should I have described my skin before describing my soul?" "You never asked." People had begun to slow down. A few stared openly now. In a town like Riverbrook, a well-dressed black woman standing alone with a white businessman was already unusual. A public rejection made it a spectacle. Harold glanced around nervously. "You have to understand my position," he whispered. "My business, my reputation. This town has certain expectations." Amara felt the sting, not of surprise, but of recognition. This wasn't love standing in front of her. It was fear. Fear of whispers. Fear of judgment. Fear of standing beside a woman the town had already decided didn't belong. "I can pay for your ticket back," Harold added quickly, pulling crumpled bills from his pocket. "A hotel for a few days, until you figure things out. Money." His final answer to 6 months of promises. Amara's grip tightened on her trunk, not from sadness, but from something colder, controlled anger. Because in that moment, she realized something painfully clear. Harold Pierce had never fallen in love with her. He had fallen in love with the version of her he imagined. One without her history, one without her color, one without her truth. And just as she prepared to pick up her trunk and walk away alone, a deep voice cut through the tension like thunder on a clear day. "I imagined someone different," Harold stammered, his voice cracking as he took a step backward, as if physical distance could somehow undo what his eyes had already seen. The bouquet of flowers in his hand drooped under his sweaty grip, petals bending and breaking, a quiet reflection of the moment unraveling between them. Different. The word echoed in Amara's mind, heavier than any insult he could have spoken outright. She lifted her chin slowly, refusing to let her shoulders collapse under the weight of his disappointment. "Should I have warned you?" she asked, her voice calm, deliberate. "That my skin is dark, but my feelings are real. That my mind is sharp and my heart is sincere." She paused. "You never asked." Harold's eyes flickered with panic. Around them, the station no longer felt anonymous. People had started to notice. A woman pretending to adjust her gloves lingered too long. A man leaned against a pillar, openly staring. 2 station workers slowed their walk, curiosity outweighing courtesy. In Riverbrook, this was not an ordinary scene. A well-dressed black woman standing proudly on a platform. A white businessman visibly recoiling from her. Public rejection wasn't just uncomfortable here, it was entertainment. "You have to understand," Harold whispered urgently, glancing at the onlookers. "My reputation matters. My store supports half the town. People talk." Amara's lips pressed together. So this was his fear. Not hurting her. Not breaking promises. but being seen. This town isn't ready for something like this, he continued, his voice dropping as if the town itself were listening. Amara felt a familiar sting, the kind that came not from shock, but from recognition. She had heard variations of these words her entire life. Not ready, not appropriate, not acceptable. Harold reached into his coat pocket, fumbling nervously before pulling out a wad of crumpled bills. "I'll pay for your ticket back," he said quickly, desperation creeping into his tone. "A hotel, too, just for a few days, until you figure things out." He extended the money toward her. The gesture was small, but the meaning was enormous. 6 months of letters reduced to spare change. Dreams exchanged for convenience. Her dignity weighed against his comfort. Amara stared at the money, then back at his face. In that moment, something inside her settled. Not sadness, clarity. She realized that Harold Pierce had never truly seen her. Not in ink, not in imagination, not even now. He had loved a fantasy that existed only because it had no color. Slowly, deliberately, she tightened her grip on her trunk. "I didn't come here to be bought," she said quietly. "And I didn't travel this far to disappear just to make you comfortable." Harold opened his mouth to respond, to justify himself, to soften the damage. But before he could speak, a deep, commanding voice cut through the tense air like thunder across an open field. "Is that how you solve your problems, Pierce?" the voice said calmly. "By throwing money at them and hoping they go away?" A sudden shift in the air made everyone turn. Heavy footsteps echoed across the stone platform, slow, deliberate, unhurried. A tall man stepped forward. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Alexander Maxwell. He wore simple clothes, dark trousers, a well-tailored coat worn from years of use rather than neglect. No flashy jewelry. No unnecessary display. Yet something about him commanded space, as if the world instinctively moved aside when he entered it. His presence alone altered the atmosphere. Conversation stopped. Eyes widened. Even the station clock seemed louder. Harold stiffened. His shoulders tensed as if he'd been caught doing something shameful, because he had. "I've known you for 15 years, Pierce," Alexander said calmly, his voice low but carrying effortlessly across the platform. "And I never imagined you'd expose yourself like this in public." Harold forced a laugh that sounded brittle, hollow. "This is none of your concern, Maxwell," he snapped, though his voice betrayed him. "This is a private matter." Alexander took one step closer. Slow, measured, unavoidable. "It became my concern the moment I watched you humiliate a woman who trusted you," he replied. "And the moment you decided cruelty was easier than integrity." Harold glanced around nervously. The crowd had grown. Some people recognized Alexander immediately. Whispers spread like fire. "That's Maxwell, the landowner? The one with the estates?" Alexander turned then, not to Harold, but to Amara. For the first time since arriving in Riverbrook, she felt someone truly look at her. Not at her skin, not at her clothes, but at her eyes. "Miss Wilson," he said gently, his tone shifting. "I apologize for witnessing this disgraceful behavior." Amara met his gaze cautiously. Years of experience had taught her that offers of kindness often hid traps. "Yes," she replied carefully. "I own an estate just outside town," Alexander continued. "There are guest rooms that sit empty most of the year. You would be welcome to stay, no conditions, no expectations, until you decide what comes next." A collective gasp rippled through the platform. A woman covered her mouth. A man shook his head in disbelief. Harold's face drained of color. "Maxwell, you can't be serious," he blurted out. "Do you have any idea what people will say?" Alexander finally looked back at him and smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, coldly. "The same people who sell crops on my land," he replied. "The same people whose businesses depend on my contracts. The same people who greet me politely every morning because they know exactly who feeds this town." Harold swallowed hard. For the first time, fear replaced arrogance. "You're doing this just to embarrass me," Harold muttered weakly. Alexander's expression hardened. "No," he said evenly. "I'm doing this because character matters. And today, yours failed spectacularly." Silence fell. Heavy. Final. Only then did the full weight of Harold's mistake settle in. Alexander Maxwell wasn't just a farmer. He wasn't merely wealthy. He owned nearly half the productive land in the region, controlled supply lines, provided employment to hundreds of families. Men like Harold didn't challenge him. They depended on him. Alexander extended his hand toward Amara, not insistently, but respectfully. "The choice is yours, Miss Wilson," he said. "But know this, you won't be cast aside here. Not while I'm standing." Amara hesitated. Then slowly, she placed her hand in his. The crowd watched in stunned silence as she stepped away from Harold Pierce and toward a future no one on that platform had expected, especially Harold. As Amara accepted the offer, no one knew the truth. Not the whispering crowd. Not the judgmental faces still watching her every move. Not even Alexander Maxwell. Not yet. To them, she was just a woman who had been abandoned. But inside the old, weather-worn trunk at her feet lay something far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Beneath neatly folded clothes, beneath a thin layer of blankets and personal keepsakes, were hidden false wooden panels. Panels Amara herself had carved open and sealed shut weeks ago, working late at night by candlelight, hands shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what she carried. Inside those panels were documents. Not letters, not sentimental memories. Records, land deeds with forged signatures, financial ledgers showing illegal transfers, contracts stamped with names Riverbrook respected, men who smiled in public and stole in private, names that built the town, names that controlled banks, rail lines, and grain markets. Names like Harold Pierce. Amara had not arrived in Riverbrook by accident. She had followed a trail, one that began years earlier when her father's small farm was seized under suspicious circumstances. The paperwork had looked clean, legal, final, but it wasn't, and Amara knew it. For years, she gathered fragments. A missing signature here, a date altered there, a witness paid to forget, until the truth became undeniable. Riverbrook's prosperity was built on theft, and Harold Pierce was one of the architects. Amara glanced down at the trunk briefly, a habit she couldn't stop. It was the only thing anchoring her to the truth when the world insisted she was powerless. If discovered, those documents could ruin reputations, collapse businesses, send men to prison, or get her killed. That was why she never spoke of them, why she kept her voice calm, why she learned to endure insults without reacting. Power, she had learned, was quiet, and survival required patience. As Alexander Maxwell lifted the trunk effortlessly, he noticed its unusual weight. "Carrying more than memories?" he asked casually. Amara met his eyes. "For now," she replied softly. "Just things that need protecting." Alexander studied her for a moment longer than necessary. Something in her tone, controlled, measured, didn't belong to a woman who had just lost everything. But he said nothing. Yet, as the carriage rolled away from the station, Riverbrook faded into the distance. The town slept peacefully, unaware that the truth was already inside its borders, waiting. And when the time came, Amara would no longer be asking for shelter. She would be demanding justice. The farm turned out to be nothing like Amara had imagined. Beyond the iron gates stood a vast Victorian estate, stone walls softened by climbing ivy, wide verandas, and fields that stretched farther than the eye could follow. It wasn't just land. It was legacy. Alexander Maxwell never treated her like a burden. There were no pitying looks, no reminders that she was lucky to be there. Instead, he spoke to her plainly, as one intelligent adult to another. When he learned she had once been a schoolteacher, educated and precise with words, his interest sharpened. "You won't be comfortable doing nothing," he said one evening. "So don't." The next morning, he showed her the estate's library. It was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, ledgers older than the house itself, records untouched for decades. He offered her a position organizing, cataloging, and restoring the collection. What Alexander saw was a capable woman finding purpose again. What Harold Pierce never imagined was this: that the library held more than books. It held land transfers, old property deeds, agreements quietly altered, names erased, borders redrawn, history rewritten in ink. And every evening, long after the house fell silent, Amara sat beneath the reading lamp, turning pages slowly, carefully, not searching, confirming, because the truth she carried was already there, and the Maxwell estate had just given it room to breathe. When Harold finally returned to the estate, he barely recognized her. Gone was the exhausted traveler who had arrived with dust on her shoes and uncertainty in her eyes. The woman standing before him now carried herself differently, shoulders steady, voice calm, presence undeniable. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She didn't need to. "I'll be staying in Riverbrook," Amara said evenly, folding her hands in front of her. "Indefinitely." Harold let out a sharp laugh, the kind meant to cut. "You don't belong here," he snapped, glancing around as if the walls themselves would agree with him. "This place isn't for people like you." For a moment, Amara said nothing. Then she smiled. "Not warm, not cruel. Certain. According to the law," she replied quietly. "I do." She took a single step forward and placed a folder on the table between them. Land records. Signed agreements. Dates that couldn't be argued away. Harold's eyes flicked down, just for a second, but it was enough. Enough for the room to feel smaller. Enough for his confidence to waver. Outside, voices carried from the courtyard. Staff, neighbors, witnesses. For the first time, Harold realized this conversation wasn't private, and it wasn't ending the way he had imagined. 2 weeks later, Riverbrook Town Hall overflowed. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of restless bodies. Whispers filled the air, confusion, irritation, curiosity. Everyone had come for answers, but no one expected what was about to unfold. The doors opened. Alexander Maxwell entered first, calm, composed. Behind him walked Amara. The room fell silent. She moved to the center without hesitation and placed her briefcase on the table. Slowly, deliberately. "I am the legal descendant of Joseph Freeman," she said, her voice steady but unmistakably firm. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the hall. Faces stiffened. Some turned pale. Others looked away. Amara opened the briefcase. Original land deeds. Government seals pressed into aged parchment. Verified documents bearing dates no one wanted to remember. Judge Thornton leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. The truth was undeniable. Nearly 60% of Riverbrook stood on stolen land, including Harold Pierce's store. Harold's jaw tightened as the weight of generations pressed down on him. Not rumor, not accusation, but proof. For the first time, Riverbrook wasn't arguing anymore. It was listening. "This isn't revenge," Amara declared. "It's restoration." She proposed a foundation for education, housing, and community growth. Even Harold wouldn't lose his home. He lost something far worse. His power, his reputation, his illusion of superiority. 6 months later, Riverbrook was transformed. A public library stood where Harold's store once was. Scholarships funded generations. Amara became a leader, not through anger, but vision. Standing beside Alexander, now her husband, she proved one truth. When you judge someone by their color, you risk overlooking the very person capable of changing your entire world.